you. I am always, sort of struck by, I was a federal employee for 8 years, and it's always amazing to me that there's a bureaucrat who's funny and actually intentionally funny. Steve, so actually following up behind Steve is always a challenge in knowing that. Steve, many of you may know, is also the most shameless fire punster that there is, right? For any of you think that you make bad fire jokes, or you know someone who does, Steve is actually much worse. So, which sort of introduces my launching into. I'm not going to say anything about this picture, but I just want to point out that there was a time not so long ago before FHIR, right, where we actually didn't really sort of have this. I mean, there's some folks, Graham and Ewart and Lloyd and other people who were thinking about this, in 2011, 2012. But for the rest of us, we didn't really have this world. And then a few people came and sort of got that initial spark going, and and here we are. But I do want to remind everyone of a couple of things. First off, if you just look at EHR adoption and how it's taken off, this is a very short period of time in which this has happened, right? And we're not talking about interoperability here. We're just talking about the basic tools to have interoperability, right? You imagine, how can you even think of phone networks if people don't have phones? And it wasn't that long ago when most providers in the country didn't have phones. And when you look at this chart, this is ONC data, and you can see that we didn't even get to 50% penetration roughly until something like 2013. Right, so that really was not that long ago. And so we start to think about, well, how come, sort of interoperability felt like it took so long? Well, in some ways, it's because we didn't have the basis for having interoperability in the first place. And the other thing I want to, sort of point out here as we think about this and we have the timeline here is that when Meaningful Use started, which was around 2010 for all intents and purposes, when it really, sort of had programmatic, meat to it, it was not a bug of the system that interoperability wasn't the first thing that was, that we tried to implement. It was actually a feature, right? Where the idea was that, well, look at where we are with respect to the basic tools of electronic documentation. Let's focus on that first, right? We better get those things in place and then start to think about interoperability. And there's also recognition that that's going to take some time. And we don't want to over-engineer things too early, because we don't know how technology is going to evolve. We don't know how physician practice, we don't know how patient adoption is going to evolve, and we don't know how all of those things are going to fit together, right? And in some ways, you could look at that and think, well, that was actually the right decision to not over-engineer that too early. Because imagine if we started trying to engineer health information exchange and interoperability technologies in 2011, knowing where we are now with respect to what's going on with FHIR and and FHIR adoption, the kinds of rapid evolutions that we're seeing, and some of the things that might actually sort of break apart the healthcare delivery value chain as we know it, right? So I just want to point that out for context. And then the other thing that we learned through that process is just how much fragmentation there is in the industry. And these are pictures from ONC again. And Meaningful Use may have actually contributed to this. When you started pumping more and more dollars into this, you started to get more and more vendors who were trying to respond to that need in a particularly short period of time. And that also sort of made clear that the interoperability challenge was going to be really hard. I mean, you've got this long tail. We're starting to see consolidation now, but there is still fragmentation. There's fragmentation on the hospital side. There's fragmentation on the ambulatory side. Or I have this backward. This is the hospital side. Right? So those are just sort of background things to remember as we now enter into the conversation of, so what's the Argonaut Project? How does that, how does that help to facilitate, FHIR adoption? And what does that mean about FHIR acceleration and the things that we might think about going forward to be able to try to continue the lessons learned and, see if we can keep that momentum going? So the Argonaut Project, the origins of it go all the way back to this report called the Jason Report, which was the Jason Advisors are a group of scientific luminaries who are brought together by the MITRE Corporation, organized by the MITRE Corporation, and they're asked from time to time to answer scientific questions that come from the federal government. And they were asked by ONC and AHRQ to give some thought to the sort of the infrastructure that we had for healthcare interoperability. And they came up with this report, and not surprisingly, as I just pointed out to you, for Meaningful Use and everything we were doing then, we deliberately sort of said, that's going to be late, interoperability is going to be a later phase thing. So here they come in with a report in 2013 and they say, surprise, surprise, wow, this is really a mess. This whole interoperability thing is, is kind of a mess. And they were very, very critical of all of the players of the status, the trajectory. They sort of had recommendations for what an approach might look like. And one of the things that they highlighted was we really need to move to a world of APIs. Right? We need to think about interoperability in those sorts of terms rather than the SOAP-based kind of transactions and other things that we were doing, sort of at that time, and still are doing, very, very heavily. So that was, so the report that came out. The national coordinator, who is then Karen DeSalvo, sort of put together a task force that I co-chaired with Dr. David McCauley from Cerner, or he's retired now, but from Cerner and these people. And we were asked to review that report. And that came to be called the Jason report, the Jason Task Force final report. Don't confuse that with the Jason report. This was the report that was reviewing the Jason Task Force. And what did we recommend coming out of that? Well, one of the things, when you look at that Jason report, and it's a really interesting document, I have the link in there for those of you who want to go and see it. One of the things that becomes clear is that the solution they came up with was an engineering solution, when I think all of you know, even though most of you are engineers, all of you know that this really isn't an engineering problem, right? Interoperability is much more about social, technical, business, cultural kinds of things. And they came up with an engineering solution. So we, kind of addressed that a little bit and said, well, there are some things in here that really aren't appropriate necessarily for the US economy, let's say, but this idea of APIs seems like a really good idea, that we should use the opportunity to sort of highlight that and point out that now we have the opportunity to start to think about how we might pivot the way interoperability works toward an API-based approach. And we were looking at, when you looked at Steve's timeline before, we were in 2013, 2014, 2015, anticipating meaningful use stage 3, ONC 2015 edition certification, and thinking those might be perfect levers for thinking about how do we start to get this API concept in there while we still have these levers from the federal government that cut across all markets across the US and have a ton of influence in the way this could move forward. So that was the recommendations that we had, was to sort of let's start thinking about how APIs can start to become a part of that. So then how did that turn into the Argonaut Project? Well, there were a few things, right? So there was a group of people who left a meeting. So we presented these findings to a joint meeting of the HIT Standards Committee and the HIT Policy Committee. They unanimously approved it. Everyone walked out. Everyone was really happy. Karen DeSalvo high-fived David and I as we walked out the door. And then a bunch of people went and met at a restaurant. So they had, Jason report on their minds, and they met at the Agora restaurant in Washington, D.C. It was a Greek restaurant. And I suspect that there was plenty of motivating sort of spirits that were involved. I wasn't at that meeting, actually. So there were a lot of motivating spirits, and somehow that led, I think, to thoughts around Greek mythology and Jason and the Argonauts, and that's how the Argonaut Project was born. Quite literally, that's how the Argonaut Project was born. Was that group of individuals who said, you know what, we have a critical mass here. As we start to think about how APIs are going to work, and with the opportunity that we have in front of us for federal regulation being an enabling force in this, let's try to get some market input into this process early on, so that Steve doesn't blunder his way into this and implement all sorts of regulations that no one can implement. I'm only teasing. Steve was, I think, well aware of the issues as well. And so, but the idea was, can we rapid cycle some market input into this before this becomes instantiated in federal regulation? So that was really what we set out to do. So there are a few problems that we were trying to solve. One, speed. How do we get this stuff done faster, working with HL7 as a standards development organization, but trying to accelerate some of those processes a little bit so that we can get this stuff out, sort of in market speed. Priority, how do we focus on things that we think matter more than other things? Because I think, as all of you know, FHIR is a very broad standard, and there are some things that are more important to the industry right now, as opposed to other things that may not be. How do we get implementers involved as early as possible, so that we get the actual people who are having to use this, who are having to build this and worry about this every single day? How do we get them more involved from the beginning? And then how do we get this to be something that's collaborative as well? We've got all that fragmentation that I showed before. It's not as if one vendor or two vendors can do this and the rest of the market will just follow. You've got to get a collaboration among a number of vendors to be able to get that done. So we put together what we think of as an implementation community. It's not a standards development activity. Everything we do, we try to funnel back into HL7 to get formal blessing through the SDO process. We're not a separate legal entity. We're really just an initiative that comes together, gets funding from a number of players, and then we do a bunch of sprints on an annual basis to try to move forward in particular use cases that we think are important to the industry. And lastly, we're not a proprietary activity. I mean, everything we do, we live by HL7 rules loosely, and we also publish everything openly and make it all available to the industry at large. So these are the organizations that are behind the Argonaut Project and actively participate in it. As you can see, a number of technology vendors as well as provider organizations. Started off with more EHR kind of vendors on the technology side and SureScripts, and we've been grateful to have other players like Apple, Microsoft, and others coming in as we start to get more and more traction and greater visibility and greater enthusiasm for FHIR and the kinds of implementation-oriented work that we're doing. So what is it that we do? A couple of things I would just feature. One is setting priorities, right? So just in a very practical way, trying to say, well, what if we focused on the 2015 edition, the Common Clinical Data Set, now called the US CDI? And what if we just said, let's focus on those resources, because those are the ones that we think are going to matter most. Partly because the regulatory push is behind those, but just remember that the US CDI was created with the idea that these are things that matter most in day-to-day clinical care, so that's why we should be pushing on those, right? So we said, let's focus on those resources and try to accelerate the maturity of those, not because others aren't important, but because these things seem to be really important. Then the other thing we did is we tried to resolve practical problems, search parameters, what are you going to get with respect to content? And these things are important when you think about scalability of apps. If we want to be able to have a thriving app ecosystem with small and large vendors developing apps, they want to be able to scale across EHR systems, right? I showed you the fragmentation. They want to be able to do that scaling, and they're not going to be able to get that scaling if they don't have some basic expectation about how clients and servers are going to behave, which isn't a part of the specification. It's just a convention that everyone develops to say, here's how we're going to do it, so that everyone isn't sort of driven crazy by having different requirements about just the way clients and servers behave. So that's one of the things that we do as well. And then, so we published in 2016, we published that first implementation guide, which was basically saying, let's take that common clinical data set and FHIR enable it, essentially, building on the work that, that Josh and the Smart team had done with Smart on FHIR, and saying, let's just put that through a whole bunch of testing, iron out a bunch of wrinkles, and then, see if we can publish that and get some adoption around that. And then, since then, one of the things that we learned after we published that first one was, our first thought was, well, job well done. That's what we organized to do. Maybe we're done. And then we got a lot of feedback from the sponsors around the table saying, this platform is actually pretty effective. And it seems like it's a pretty good thing for us to come together, everyone take off their proprietary commercial hat and just try to work together as stakeholders and engineers to try to solve some very practical problems and get this stuff done a little bit faster and out to market a little bit faster. So we then set on the model of just working on 3 to 4 use cases every year and trying to get implementations guides out on roughly an annual cycle that are things, artifacts that people can pick up and implement. And so you can see there the list. I provided links to all of those, and hopefully those are helpful to all of you. And one of the things that this has led to then is when you think about the timeline, Steve talked about the timeline of 11 years from the iPhone from the first iPhone to the iPhone adopting the Argonaut implementation guide for the availability of clinical data and the Apple Health Record. I think of it as 3 years, which was the origins of the Argonaut Project with Smart on FHIR behind it in December 2014, so January 2015 effectively, and then January 2018 its availability in one of the most admired and certainly one of the most ubiquitous consumer devices in the world, right? I mean, that I think exceeded everyone's expectations about how fast that might happen. So Steve already showed you these slides, so I won't belabor the point, but there's obviously a ton of enthusiasm that's sort of built on the work and everything that's happening with respect to FHIR. Adoption, of course, lagging enthusiasm like it always does, and what we want to do is keep the enthusiasm growing, but keep the adoption sort of at least on the same slope, even if it's going to be dragging behind a little bit. And one of the things I like to point out is we're just scratching the surface here. and how do we think about how this moves forward in a way that is scalable across the industry? So, if you think about a FHIR API, and all of your engineers, half of you are thinking it's not really 3 dimensions, it's an n-dimensional thing. Well, yeah, I've just projected it down to 3 dimensions. But if we kind of think about, on 1 dimension is, well, content, right? If we think about the availability of APIs, and what I'm thinking of is common APIs that if you're an app developer, you have a reasonable expectation to think, I could build an app against this particular set of things, this particular set of requirements, and have some ability, some reason to think that I could scale this across vendor systems, right? If you sort of think of that as the problem, well, there's content would be one. What information is available? Structured data elements, what type of structured data elements, clinical notes, administrative stuff, genomics, what are those things? And then functions. How much, can I actually just read? Can I read and write? Can I do other kinds of things, update, delete? And then we have bulk data access, hooks, all sorts of different patterns that one could think of. And then there's kind of use case availability, because when you look at the maps that that Steve had shown before, one of the things that's really, it's really impressive when you think about the short period of time in which that's happened. On the other hand, you have to realize what that's not. That's just the vendor reporting that they have an API that's based on FHIR for a patient-facing use case that was required for EHR certification and meaningful use, right? That's all that says. That doesn't say that it's an API that covers that whole cube and is available for every use case, whether you're a provider or a patient for use cases outside of that, or any other, kind of app developer or any other stakeholder who has, kinds of functions and needs that you want to be able to, take advantage of for, to deliver value. And I'll just point out that we've just scratched the surface in the sense that the ONC EHR certification requirements cover just that little piece of it, and that's what's led to the amazing adoption that we've seen so far, right? So the role that the federal government plays here, if they are very judicious in their regulations, just enough regulations, Steve, play a force in the U.S. that, because we're so fragmented on the supply side and the demand side, among vendors, payers, providers, what have you, that is in some ways almost the only unifying force that can create this floor that's hopefully a dynamically rising floor on what people can expect to see if you're a developer and you want to be able to do stuff across EHR vendor systems. Because otherwise, what you get is a lot of variation. And this isn't proprietary data. This is all off of the public websites and the public documentation that these vendors have up there. And a couple things I like to point out. One is you can see there's some commonality, a lot of that driven by the Argonaut implementation guide and ONC requirements that sort of say have an API that does CCDS and that sort of defines it. And then you have variation in the places where there aren't those requirements, right? And that's not because vendors are trying to sort of lock everyone into their way of doing it. It's because each of the vendors sees the market in different ways, and their customers have different kinds of needs, and so they go off and develop in different ways according to what their customer needs are, and that may not be on the same timeline or with the same exact functionalities. But if you're an app developer, you're thinking, oh wow, it's hard for me to scale across some of these things that I want to be able to do if only 1 or 2 vendors are supporting it, and if I have to figure it out every 6 months, right? So that's a little bit of the challenge of, how do we get that? So if we think about the healthcare value chain for a second, the Argonaut implementation guide and ONC certification, all of that played a certain role in helping to further that. But we've got a really complex value chain here in the U.S., right? And this is just sort of a very simplified view, obviously. And then as we sort of move forward a little bit, we start to open up the opportunity that, well, maybe patients can actually play a little bit more of a direct role here, because now they can have these tools based on modern internet conventions and apps and the kinds of ways we think about using the internet in our day-to-day lives. Maybe we can actually have a little bit more control, a little more power to do the kinds of things that we want to do in intervening in our own healthcare, right, and playing a little bit more active role in that. Right now, it's mostly passive, as we know. But I think that we can think about how we can start to have things that will start to make it a little bit more active and provide those tools, and can perhaps sort of break up the value chain a little bit, just like has happened in every other part of the economy, literally in the US anyway. And that might mean that you start to even think about sort of patients being much more active across the spectrum. And the providers are really not a fundamental part of that value chain, but they're just another part of the value chain, that I've got a whole bunch of things that are now in my control. And some of those things are things that come to me through providers, but I've got more and more in my control than I had before. And some of those things are delivered to me as apps and other kinds of things, and maybe insurance, right? You start to think about that differently. You start to think about maybe life insurance starts to play much more of a role in my lifetime, sort of perspective in terms of amortizing the way that resources are spent over my lifetime rather than being just health insurance or employer tied or what have you. And the only thing I'm pointing out is that as you start to think about this, you need more and more acceleration activity around use cases to help to mature the FHIR standards to enable those kinds of use cases, right? That doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it doesn't happen just by all of us sitting here waiting for the crop to grow. It happens by people saying, I really want to solve this use case, and I'm going to move forward to do that. Just a couple more slides, Reed. So what does that mean? That means that we start to hopefully spur other kinds of acceleration activities that sort of build on some of the lessons and take off and and learn from some of the things that maybe we got wrong with the Argonaut project to say, let's build those around other kinds of use cases. And there are two types. One is called FHIR accelerator projects, and the other called FHIR community projects, where the only difference really at the end of the day, and these are kind of high level, but the only difference at the end of the day are there's some that are going to ballot their artifacts through HL7 and develop those as formally balloted artifacts, right? However they do that, and that's what they want to do. And that's really a choice that they make as a set of stakeholders. But I think, as all of you know, there are a lot of other participants in the FHIR community at large in the US and across the world who may not ever want to ballot their initiatives through HL7. However, they still want to make valuable contributions to FHIR. And whether it's HIMSS or IHE or all sorts of other groups that want to be able to do that. And so there's this growing idea of the sense of FHIR community projects that can have some kind of like governance and coordination among them so that we have some expectation that they are also sort of participating and abiding by a set of community understandings of how all of this should work so that we all have trust and faith in the artifacts that are coming out, and that can help to grow that FHIR ecosystem as we move forward. And it can do it in different use cases. So last slide I'll put up. I have many more slides, trust me. But the last slide I'll put up is there are some current FHIR accelerator projects. So the Argonaut Project, the Cairn Alliance, who I think all of you have probably heard of and are speaking here, and Da Vinci are the first three, but there are a number that are in the wings now that are sort of part of the pipeline. Some focused on social determinants of health, on public health, on cancer, on clinical input. And one might imagine these organically forming communities that are focused on different aspects of FHIR and trying to mature those sort of for the betterment of filling out that whole ecosystem that I was describing, that will hopefully sort of get us to a healthcare systems that's much more responsive to sort of patient needs rather than it all being funneled and sort of corralled in the way that it is today. So thank you very much. I hope that was really helpful, and have a great time at the rest of FHIR DevDays.
Thank you, Micky. Maybe there's time for one or two questions for Steve and Micky before we head to the next session. Please, a brief question that requires a yes or no answer. Who? We have mics.
I'm going to pass all questions off to you. So.
Great.
I want to know if Micky knows that I'm. I want to know if Micky knows that I'm presenting after Micky.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. That was a good question.
Actually, it's no. Steve knew.
No?
Wow. Everybody wants coffee.
Oh, here.
Right.
No, it's not time for coffee yet.
Bourbon?
The bar is not open.
Uzo.
At our bar.
Hi.
We've got to volunteer for the first round, though.
Here.
So I work in the area of privacy auditing and that sort of area. And so we're really interested in the audit messages and understanding who's accessing records and whether those are being done appropriately. Do you know if that's on the roadmap for Argonaut or any of the standards and regulations?
Who's the
What was the
Micky or Steve?
and was it a? I didn't understand the last part of the question.
I just want to know what's the roadmap for including audit and kind of so we can protect patient privacy and understanding who's accessing whose record.
Right. Yeah, not within the scope of Argonaut right now. In other places it is. Doesn't mean it's not important, but.
Okay, no more. Oh, here.
Last one.
Last one.
I went to that session, Smart and FHIR, and OAuth 2 is covered for the STTU2 and does not cover R4. We are already in R4. How can we speed up that support?
Yeah, so you'll be happy to know that's underway with Argonaut, and then Steve can speak to regulation.
So when you say underway, how long does it take? Do you know?
No, you can talk to Josh here too. This is one of the benefits of having all the right people in the room. You can cover it if you want, but I was otherwise going to say that the App Launch Framework IG that got published now supports R4.
Yeah, the guide itself is designed to work with versions of FHIR from 2 on up, so it's not specific to a version of FHIR.
Okay, and that was the final question. Thank you all.
All right, thank you.